Preface to The Seven Tablets of Creation by Leonard William King, 1902. Preface. Perhaps no section of Babylonian literature has been more generally studied than the legends which record the creation of the world. On the publication of the late Mr. George Smith's work, The Chaldean Account of Genesis, which appeared some 27 years ago, it was recognized that there was, in the Babylonian account of the creation as it existed in the 7th century before Christ, much which invited comparison with the corresponding narrative in the book of Genesis. It is true that the Babylonian legends, which had been recovered and were first published by him, were very fragmentary, and that the exact number and order of the tablets or sections of which they were composed and were quite uncertain, and that, although they recorded the creation of the heavens and of the heavenly bodies, they contained no direct account of the creation of man. In spite of this, however, their resemblance to the Hebrew narrative was unmistakable, and in consequence they at once appealed to a far larger circle of students than would otherwise have been the case. After the appearance of Mr. Smith's work, other scholars produced translations of the fragments which he had published, and the names of Oppert, Schrader, and Sayce will always be associated with those who were the first to devote themselves to the interpretation of the creation legends. Moreover, new fragments of the legends have from time to time been acquired by the trustees of the British Museum, and of these the most important is the fine text of the 4th tablet of the creation series, containing the account of the fight between the god Marduk and the dragon Tiamat, which was published in 1887 by Dr. Wallace Budge, and translated by Professor Sayce in the same year. Professor Sayce's translation of the creation legends marked a distinct advance upon those of his predecessors, and it was the most complete inasmuch as he was enabled to make use of the new tablet, which restored so much of the central portion of the story. In the year 1890, in his important work, Die Kosmologie der Babylonier, Professor Jensen of Marburg gave a translation of the legend together with a transliteration and commentary. In 1895, Professor Zimmern of Leipzig translated all the fragments then known, and a year later, Professor Delitzsch of Berlin also published a rendering. Finally, 2 years ago, Professor Jensen issued a new and revised translation of the creation legends in the opening pages of the first part of his work, Mythen and Epin, the second part of which, containing his notes and commentary, appeared some months ago. In the course of the year 1900, the writer was entrusted with the task of copying the texts of a number of Babylonian and Assyrian legends for publication in the series of cuneiform texts from Babylonian tablets, etc., in the British Museum, and among the documents selected for issue were those relating to the creation of the world. Several of the texts of the creation legends, which had been used by previous translators, had never been published, and one tablet, which Mr. George Smith had consulted in 1876, had not been identified by subsequent workers. During my work, I was so fortunate as to recognize this tablet, and was enabled to make copies of all the texts, not only of those which were previously known, but also of a number of new duplicates and fragments, which I had meanwhile identified. These copies appeared in cuneiform texts, Part 13, 1901, plates 1 through 41. The most interesting of the new fragments there published was a tablet which restored a missing portion of the text of the 2nd tablet of the creation series, and of this, on account of its interest, I gave a translation in a note to the plate on which the text appeared. It was not my intention at that time to publish anything further upon the subject of the creation legends. While I was engaged, however, in searching for fragments of other Babylonian legends for publication officially, it was my good fortune to come across a fine duplicate of the 2nd tablet of the creation series. A further prolonged search was rewarded by the finding of other fragments of the poem, and a study of those showed me that the earlier portions of the text of the creation story, as already known, could be considerably augmented. Among them, moreover, was a fragment of the poem which refers to the creation of man. This fragment is extremely important, for in addition to its valuable contents, it also settles the disputed question as to the number of tablets, or sections, of which the creation series was composed. In view of the additional information as to the form and contents of the poem, which made this new material afforded, it was clearly necessary that a new translation of the creation legends should be made, and this I undertook forthwith. The new fragments of the poem which I had identified up to the summer of last year are inscribed upon tablets of the Neo-Babylonian period. At the conclusion of the examination of tablets of this class, I lithographed the newly identified texts in a series of plates which are published in the second volume of the present work. These plates were already printed off when, at the beginning of the present year, after my return from Assyria, I identified a fresh group of fragments of the poem inscribed, not upon Neo-Babylonian, but upon Assyrian tablets. At that time I was engaged on making a detailed catalogue, or hand list, of the smaller fragments in the various collections of Assyrian tablets from Kuyunjik, and as a result of previous study of the legends themselves and of the Assyrian commentaries to the seventh tablet of the series, I was enabled to identify 10 new fragments of the poem which are inscribed upon tablets from the library of Ashur-bani-pal at Nineveh. In order to avoid upsetting the arrangement of the plates in Volume 2, the texts of the new Assyrian fragments are published by means of outline blocks in Appendices 1 and 2 to the present volume. Those who have studied the published texts of the creation series will remember that the material used by previous translators of the legends has consisted of some 21 tablets and fragments inscribed with portions of the poem. The number of new tablets and fragments belonging to the creation series which are here used and translated for the first time reaches the total of 34. But as I have joined up 6 of these to other similar fragments, this total has been reduced to 28. Thus, in place of the 21 tablets previously known, 49 separate tablets and fragments have now been identified as containing portions of the text of the creation series. The new information furnished by the recently discovered material regarding the story of creation may here be briefly summarized. Hitherto, our knowledge of the contents of tablets 1 and 2 of the series has been very fragmentary. After the narrative of the creation of the great gods in the opening lines of the poem, and a fragmentary reference to the first symptoms of revolt exhibited by the primeval monsters Apsu and Tiamat, and Mumu, the minister of Apsu, there occurred a great gap in the text, and the story began again with the account of how Tiamat prepared to wage war against the gods. Apsu and Mumu have at this point entirely disappeared from the narrative, and the ally of Tiamat is the god Kingu, whom she appoints to command her forces. What followed the creation of the great gods, what was the cause of the revolt, what was the fate of Apsu and Mumu, and what were the events which led up to Tiamat's preparations for battle, are questions that have hitherto remained unanswered. We now know that the account of the creation of the gods was no fuller than that which has come down to us from Damascus. After the birth of Lakhmu and Lakhamu, Anshar and Kishar, Anu, Bel, i.e., Enlil or Elil and Ea, Nudimud, the text does not proceed to narrate in detail the coming forth of the lesser deities, but plunges at once into the story of the revolt of the primeval forces of chaos. We now know, also, that it was Apsu and not Tiamat who began the revolt against the gods, and that, according to the poem, his enmity was aroused not by the creation of light, as has been previously suggested, but by the disturbance of his rest in consequence of the new way of the gods, which tended to produce order in place of chaos. One of the most striking facts which the new fragments furnish with regard to the contents of the legends is the prominent part played by the god Ea in the earlier episodes of the story. After Apsu and Mumu had repaired to Tiamat and had hatched with her their plot against the gods, it was the god Ea who, abounding in all wisdom, detected their plan and frustrated it. The details of Ea's action are still a matter of uncertainty, but, as I have shown in the introduction, it is clear that Apsu and Mumu were overthrown, and that their conqueror was Ea. Moreover, it was only after their downfall and in order to avenge them that Tiamat began her preparations for battle. She was encouraged in her determination by the god Kingu, and it was in consequence of the assistance he then gave her that she afterwards appointed him leader of her host. Another point which is explained by the new fragments concerns the repetitions in tablets 1, 2, and 3 of the lines containing the account of Tiamat's preparations for battle. The lines describing this episode are given no less than 4 times, in Tablet 1, in Tablet 2, and twice in Tablet 3. We now know that the first description of Tiamat's preparations occurs after the account of her determination to avenge her former allies, and in the second tablet the lines are put into the mouth of Ea, who continues to play a prominent part in the narrative, and carries the tidings to Anshar. How Anshar repeated the lines to Gaga, his messenger, and how Gaga delivered the message to Lakmu and Lakhamu is already well known. Perhaps the most striking of all the new fragments of the poem here published is that which contains the opening and closing lines of the 6th tablet, and, at last, furnishes us with a portion of the text describing the creation of man. We now know that, as in the Hebrew narrative, the culminating act of creation was the making of man. Marduk is here represented as declaring to Ea that he will create man from his own blood, and from bone which he will form. It is important to note that the Assyrian word here used for bone, isimutu, which has not hitherto been known, corresponds to the Hebrew word esem, bone, which occurs in Genesis 2:2-3, in connection with the accounts of the creation of woman. The text thus furnishes another point of resemblance between the Babylonian and the Hebrew stories of creation. The new fragment also corroborates in a remarkable degree the account given by Berosus of the Babylonian versions of the creation of man. According to the writer's rendering of the passage, Marduk declares that he will use his own blood in creating mankind, and this agrees with the statement of Berosus, that Bel directed one of the gods to cut off Bel's head, and to form mankind from his blood mixed with earth. This subject is discussed at length and in detail in the introduction, as well as a number of new points of resemblance between the Babylonian and the Hebrew accounts of the creation, which are furnished by other recently identified fragments of the poem. With regard to the extent and contents of the creation series, we now know that the tablet of which the series was composed are 7 in number, and we also possess the missing context or framework of the 7th tablet, which contains addresses to Marduk under his 50 titles of honor. From this we learn that when the work of creation was ended, the gods gathered together once more in Upshukinaku, their council chamber. Here they seated themselves in solemn assembly and proceeded to do honor to Marduk, the creator, by reciting before him the remarkable series of addresses which form the contents of the last tablet of the poem. Many of the missing portions of the 7th tablet, including the opening lines, it has been found possible to restore from the new fragments and duplicates here published. In the following pages, a transliteration of the text of the creation series is given, which has been constructed from all the tablets and fragments now known to be inscribed with portions of the poem, together with a translation and notes. For comparison with the legends contained in the creation series, translations have been added of the other Babylonian accounts of the history of creation, and of some texts closely connected therewith. Among these mention may be made of the extracts from a Sumerian text, and from a somewhat similar one in Babylonian, referring to the creation of the moon and the sun. These are here published from a so-called practice tablet or student's exercise. A remarkable address to a mythical river, to which the creation of the world is ascribed, is also given. In the first appendix, the Assyrian commentaries to the seventh tablet are examined in detail, and some of the fragments of text are described which bear a striking resemblance to the seventh tablet, and are of considerable interest for the light they throw on the literary history of the poem. Among the texts dealt with in the second appendix, one of the most interesting is a Babylonian duplicate of a tablet which has been supposed to contain the instructions given by Marduk to man after his creation, but is now shown by the duplicate to be part of a long didactic composition containing moral precepts, and to have nothing to do with the creation series. Similarly, in the fourth appendix, I have printed a copy of the text, which has been commonly but erroneously supposed to refer to the Tower of Babel. The third appendix includes some hitherto unpublished astrological texts of the period of the Arsacidae, which contain astrological interpretations and explanations of episodes in the creation story. They indicate that Tiamat, in her astrological character, was regarded as a star or constellation in the neighborhood of the ecliptic, and they moreover furnish an additional proof of the identification of her monster brood with, at any rate, some of the zodiacal constellations. During the preparation of this work, I have, of course, consulted the translations and renderings of the creation legends, which have been made by other workers on the subject, and especially those of Professors Jensen, Zimmern, and Delitzsch. I have much pleasure in expressing here my indebtedness to their published works for suggestions which I have adopted from them. To Mr. R. Campbell Thompson I am indebted for the ready assistance he has afforded me during my search for new fragments and duplicates of the legends. In conclusion, my thanks are due to Dr. Wallace Budge for his friendly suggestions, which I have adopted throughout the progress of the work. L. W. King, London, July 31st, 1902. End of the Preface to the Seven Tablets of Creation by Leonard William King.